Welcome, everybody, to On This Day on the Grueling Truth Sports Network. I'm your host for On This Day, Mike Goodpasser, and today we're going to talk about February the 4th, 1969, the day the Oakland Raiders hired John Madden to be their head football coach. Now, John Madden's a guy who, if you're not in your 50s like me, you may forget that the guy was a football coach because, of course, you had the Madden football that came out in the late 80s, early 90s. You had him with Pat Summerall in the broadcasting booth for what seemed like forever with his boom and his pow and his humor and his knowledge of professional football. John Madden, we're going to talk about today a little bit, his accomplishments as the Oakland Raiders coach, which a lot of people don't know about, and also the kind of man he is. And a lot of that stems from Darryl Stingley in an incident that happened in a preseason game in, I think it was 1976-77. But yeah, today, a few decades after pro football's most underrated coach, John Madden departed with one Super Bowl ring and one ulcer. He earned a ring. He didn't deserve the ulcer. And as George Blanda once said, out of all the coaches I slaved for, John Madden was the kindest and the most thoughtful. He was also the most overlooked, which is kind of strange when you look at a man who's 6'4", 260 pounds, red hair, invariably in shirt sleeves, no matter what the weather was. He dominated the Oakland Raiders sideline, but he still toiled. He toiled in the shadow of the legendary owner for the Oakland Raiders, Al Davis, who was the Raiders' general managing genius. Now, as late as the 1975 American Conference Championship game, in his seventh season as coach, John Madden was discussing the Raiders' bitter 16-10 loss to the Steelers in Pittsburgh. That was basically an icy day, very controversial on whether the Steelers allowed the field to be icy to help them out. But a newsman unthinkingly or unknowingly addressed him as Al. Coach Madden just kind of shook his head, looked at the man and said, "My name's John." That's a hell of a thing to mess up. Now, the next season, the Raiders would have one of the greatest football teams of all time. They would beat the Patriots in a fairly controversial playoff game, avenging a loss earlier in the season to them. And then they would go on to win the AFC Championship game over the hated Pittsburgh Steelers, and then finally beat Bud Grant and a great Minnesota Vikings team to win his first Super Bowl. Now, after winning the Super Bowl, of course, more people knew John Madden's name. But to many people, he still remained Al Davis' coach. That has always been too bad because John Madden was a hell of a football coach and quite a man. He was kind and thoughtful, and as George Blanda said, and as Darryl Stingley knew back then, the night in that summer after the preseason game, when the New England Patriots wide receiver was paralyzed in a collision with Jack Tatum, he was rushed by an ambulance to a hospital in the Oakland area. In the confusion of the game, Madden was not aware of the extent of Stingley's injury until he was told about it in the locker room. The Raiders coach asked, "Where is he?" He was told to Castro Valley Hospital. So, of course, John Madden immediately goes to Castro Valley Hospital. At the hospital, John Madden discovered Darryl Stingley was being prepared for surgery. Hurrying through the waiting room door, he went upstairs to surgery where a doctor he knew lent him a surgeon's gown, and inside the operating room, he comforted Darryl Stingley. Now, then he left, got on a phone, and called the Oakland airport, where the Patriots were on their chartered jetliner for the flight back to Boston that night. He was under the impression that the Patriots had abandoned their paralyzed player. He told an airport man, "You get Chuck Fairbanks off that plane. I've got to talk to him." When the Patriots coach came to the phone, he explained to John Madden that a front office man had stayed behind and was busy at the Patriots motel. The next day, when Stingley's wife arrived from Chicago, the Raiders head coach invited her to stay with him and his wife at their home. She declined, preferring to sleep at the hospital in an office near the intensive care ward. But throughout her stay in Oakland, until her husband was transferred in an air ambulance to the Chicago Rehabilitation Institute, she often went to the Maddens' home for dinner. Virginia Madden also visited the hospital regularly to comfort her and to check on her husband. John Madden told a friend not too many years ago, "On the field, we play hard. But when something like Daryl's injury happens, we're all in this game together." Now, for 10 seasons, John Madden and Al Davis were together as kind of the odd couple. Another example that opposites do sometimes attract. Now, some people in Oakland contend that Al Davis' second guessing finally influenced the 42-year-old John Madden to retire, especially because of the club owner's sniping during the 1978 season, when the 79 season, when the Raiders missed the playoffs for only the second time in the coach's tenure. Madden would go on to say, "Al and I had a great relationship. Nobody will ever believe that, but we did." John Madden has always been grateful to Al Davis for knighting him as the Raiders head coach in 1969 at the age of 32. He then was Pro Football's youngest head coach. In his 10 seasons, his Raiders team had a regular season record of 103 victories against only 32 defeats and 7 ties. Throw out the ties, and his winning percentage is .763. Better than Don Shula. Better than almost everybody in the Hall of Fame. Now, Madden did explain he wanted 100 victories before he retired. But he said, "I got that. I won a Super Bowl. Don't feel sorry for me. In retiring, I did what I wanted to do." Now, he also did what his doctors wanted him to do, because he was hospitalized at one point for a bleeding ulcer. During one game, his final season in 1979, he had another ulcer attack, as some players thought he might collapse on the sidelines that day. But the medication for his ulcers was not enough. He needed to get away from the fire on Sunday, as Vince Lombardi once called it, the fire that was burning John Madden's insides. And for all the American Football League historians, John Madden's departure was another nail in the coffin. The Rams, except for Ray Malavasi, and briefly the Broncos in 1966, all the AFL head coach in its 10 seasons were off the sidelines by 1979. John Madden was the last active AFL coach from the 1970 merger realignment, and like so many others, he left his heart in the AFL. Madden once said, "When we played Denver for the AFC title in 1977, it upset me to see the NFL shield painted across the 50-yard line. With those two old AFL teams, we should have had something from the AFL decorating the field. But I guess there's no place in pro football for a sentimentalist." I would say, when you ask Darryl Stingley, or if you would have asked him, of course he passed away, I would think Darryl Stingley would disagree with you. Because pro football, in John Madden, had the kind of man that should be coaching a football team, who should be leading men. Because, sure, he wanted to win, but he understood the importance of the safety of his players and taking care of these players. And that's something that I think a lot of football coaches at all levels, from Pee Wee through the NFL, miss these days. And when you hear the guys that played for John Madden talk about John Madden, they make that abundantly clear. So on this day, February the 4th, 1969, Al Davis made maybe his greatest move when he hired a 32-year-old coach named John Madden to run the Oakland Raiders for the next decade. All right, guys, you've been listening to On This Day on the Grueling Truth Sports Network. You can hear us every day. You can follow us at Grueling Truth, and you can hear us anywhere a podcast are played. So for now, this has been Mike Goodpaster. You've been listening to The Grueling Truth, where the legends speak.